So, Dr. Tom Wood, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
In our pre-conversation, just when we were sort of getting to know each other a bit, we spoke a little bit about neuroplasticity. I think I'd be really excited to talk about this, and I think it was quite an interesting way to frame this conversation because growing up in the UK, I was brought up with all sorts of misconceptions around neuroplasticity. Can you clear up some of these misconceptions? Because I was growing up thinking I've got until 25 to learn everything I'm going to learn, and then that's basically the height of my limited cognitive prowess I'll get. Could you clear this up for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the short answer is, well, that's just completely wrong. So we can start there. We could step back for a second and just talk about the concept of neuroplasticity, which is just that, in its simplest form, the brain adapting to the inputs that it receives and strengthening connections that are important, as well as weakening other connections that are less important. That's essentially the role of the brain when it's functioning as it should. And so there's this idea that once you reach a certain age, so kind of mid-20s, we think we've finished brain development on average. There's going to be some wiggle room there, but that's when you might have heard the sort of the white matter, which is a big part of the human brain that is responsible for fast connections between the outer cortex, the grey matter, and then also all of the body. That sort of is cemented around that age, and then the prefrontal cortex in particular, which is right at the front of the brain, which is responsible for executive function, decision making. That kind of finally matures sometime in your mid-20s, which is often why earlier in life maybe we're not so good at making complex decisions, right? Because that area of the brain is still developing. So that is all true, and up to that point, and up to the point that we finish formal education, whenever that happens, and that's different for different people based on where they live and their opportunities and socioeconomic status and things like that. In that period of time, the brain is essentially, for want of a better word, it's a sponge, right? It's continuously receiving inputs and adapting in response to try and create an organ that is suited to the environment in which it exists. So that's essentially the role of the brain, is to optimize you for the environment in which you exist. And that happens almost sort of subconsciously, or through these evolved patterns, right? Learning language, learning motor skills, learning how to walk, those things, and then also social skills and other things that we need to learn in order to survive in our environment. And that sort of is kind of baked in early in life. What people have then taken that to mean is that, well, you can't do anything, you can't create new connections, you can't learn new things later in life. And that is just not true. And we know that from both a whole host of animal research as well as research in humans. What's different is that once you get into your 30s, 40s, 50s, 80s, 90s, you've already created a brain that is, for want of a better word, optimized for the environment and the inputs it receives and the tasks that it and you need to perform. So if you want to create new connections, learn new skills, you need to put focus and effort into them, because you need to say, do you know what, brain? There are these things that we learned early in life, and yes, they're still important, but now these things are important too. So you need to direct resources and energy towards making those changes. So the brain doesn't automatically adapt in the same way, but it is absolutely capable of learning and adapting if you put effort and focus into it. And part of these misconceptions are based on just how we live our lives when we're older. So people say, I'm too old to learn a new language or learn a new skill or whatever. And yes, so part of it is this natural time course of brain development. And certain cognitive functions do decline over time on average in the population, although they are malleable and we can change that trajectory. But some also stay about the same or get better. So we get better at things under the umbrella of crystallized intelligence, which is basically just a fancy word for wisdom. As we get older, we get better at bringing together our experience, synthesizing information, making complex decisions. That is something we retain late into life. But the other part of not being able to learn, quote unquote, not being able to learn later in life is that like we're busy and we're stressed and we're tired and we have a family, and learning a language in school is very different from trying to find the time and the energy to learn a language when we're in our 40s and we have all these other things that take our time. So part of it is this natural trajectory of brain development, which is not bad. It's important because you want your brain to sort of be a product of the environment. And part of it is that we don't put the effort in that we did when we were younger. And so I think that's another part of it. But should we do that? The brain is absolutely capable of change and learning and improving essentially all the way to the end of life.
It segues not quite nicely to my next question, and I mute my ears hearing that from someone who's actually studied this like yourself, right? Not just some hunch or something I read in a paper and couldn't quite understand myself. But I remember when I got to the age of 25, I suddenly thought, okay, that thing I read about is going to happen now. And actually, I took the foot off the gas with trying to learn as much as I could. So it's almost the belief in what I thought was going to happen actually altered my behavior.
Absolutely.
And then subsequently, I think I've learned enough to sort of pop that bubble and think, actually, all good. I'm back in. I can push the ceiling as high as I can try and get it. I'm back in the game. So when it comes to belief effects and how we can focus on optimizing our cognitive health, or for lack of a better word, optimizing our cognitive health, or actually warding off cognitive decline, how much does that belief of what we can and can't change affect our trajectory, maybe specifically when it comes to retirement as well?
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest part of all of this is the beliefs that we have. And there's vast swathes of research that show that what we think directly affects our physiology and our health. The head and the body aren't two separate entities that, as we treated them for decades, if not centuries. And so what you might hear, or you imagine you might hear, is somebody says, well, I'm too old to learn something, so I won't, right? I won't even bother trying. And in my mind, it's exactly like saying, well, do you know what? I'm not as strong or as fit as I was in my 20s, so I'm just not going to exercise at all, right? There's just no point. And when I say that, hopefully most people are like, well, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Because the thing that's going to affect your fitness and strength is the not exercising rather than your age. And there's so many parallels, across how you do it, down to like the molecular biochemical level, where the brain is essentially acts just like a muscle, and its function is what I call, or what we have called, myself and my colleague Dr. Josh Techley, we've written lots about this. We call it demand driven, right? If you create demand for a specific skill or function of the brain will put resources in improving in that area, just like your performance in a deadlift or in a 400-meter run is demand driven, right? You create that demand and the body adapts accordingly. So the belief is so important, because if you don't think it's possible, you won't do it, right? And then everything stems from actually engaging in that process. So when I talk about this, I think the most important thing is to say, do you know what? This is possible, right? You can change your trajectory of cognitive function. And we see that in the research. You can, quite dramatically, I believe, decrease your risk of dementia. I could never say that dementia is completely preventable, right? But you can, at the population level, we know there are lots of modifiable factors, things we can change to decrease risk. So I believe you can strongly decrease your personal risk of cognitive decline and dementia. And just knowing that's possible, I think, having that hope that you can do that is the first step to then actually doing that and engaging in that process.
I think it's massive, even anecdotally speaking to that like slightly older cohort, especially of people in the UK. It's very much sort of determined, like, oh, okay, I'll get to a certain age and that'll be me done. And actually, there's not much I have in my control. And I think anything to push the narrative of actually there's so much in your control is really, really valuable and helpful. You've been asked I know you've been asked the question, what can we do to ward off cognitive decline? So many. So I'm going to reframe it slightly a little bit, if I may, just to make it a little bit more interesting for you. I often find if you flip it on its head, you get, with the spirit of a quote I like, which is, all I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. So in the spirit of sort of flipping on its head, what could we do to speed up cognitive decline? So then we'd have a list of things to avoid.
Yeah. Basically, you would live an industrialized Western modern lifestyle.
Brilliant.
That's how you do it.
Okay, great.
And so I can be more specific, right? You'd be completely sedentary, particularly as you get older. Actually now it starts early in life, and then as you get older, you would be socially isolated, or have most of your social connection come through some kind of screen, which is itself its own social stressor in addition to social isolation. You wouldn't sleep very much or very regularly. You would eat a highly processed, nutrient deficient, calorie dense diet. You wouldn't believe that the brain is capable of improving itself over time. Therefore, you wouldn't engage in cognitively challenging things, and you wouldn't do that because it feels hard, and we don't like doing things that are hard. We prefer to do things that are easy and feel good all the time. So that's another thing. We wouldn't ever challenge ourselves. And if you did all of that, I believe that you would do a pretty good job of accelerating cognitive decline. Maybe you mentioned retirement earlier. I didn't answer your question about retirement. Maybe we would retire early and just sit in a chair and watch TV and live out the rest of our days that would be infinitely shorter because of those choices that environmental lifestyle that we're living.
That's great. I'm gonna print that list and just put it, do the opposite of this. And I should be sweet. When it comes to retirement, can you speak more to how that relates to the demand-driven? I guess, how do you frame it? The demand-driven model of cognitive decline?
Yeah, essentially,
Yeah,
or just the demand model of
demand model.
decline.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'd love to know how the demand model relates to retirement.
So, I already said earlier that generally, as we get older, we don't tend to engage in cognitively stimulating or learning processes in the same way that we did when we were younger, and that's absolutely true. Partly because when we go to work, we specialize, right? And that's important often for our jobs. So we need to be the best at this one very specific thing, and we do that again and again and again and again. And right, that can be important for your job, but it's not necessarily the best way to sort of foster ongoing cognitive development and cognitive function. But right, I don't want a surgeon who finds every surgery he does to be a significant cognitive challenge, right? I want it to be automatic and right, it's just he's done it so many times, or they've done it so many times that it just happens. That's what we want, right? So sometimes that kind of automation is important, but it's not cognitively challenging in that same way. With that said, there's an increasing amount of evidence to show that even as adults who are doing the same thing again and again in their jobs, the degree of cognitive stimulus we get from our job is very important for our later risk of dementia. There was a study that just came out from Norway, from the Hunt studies, that showed that the amount of repetitiveness of your job was essentially predictive of your later risk of dementia, right? Because you're just not getting any cognitive stimulus from your job. Whereas if your job was more problem solving, complex tasks, being exposed to lots of different things, that was associated with a decreased risk of dementia. So even though, right, I would argue that we could all be investing more time in learning new skills and really challenging our brains, the variability in terms of challenge that we get from our jobs is also important as adults. And then when we retire, that is the sort of the biggest jump down in terms of cognitive challenge that we get in our lives, because we lose that cognitive stimulus that we're receiving from our jobs, regardless of what level that was. And actually, there is some evidence that people who have higher levels of education, which is usually associated with a higher sort of overall level of cognitive function. And again, that's not necessarily something you have control over, right? Your circumstances do determine a lot of that. So there's like a societal thing that needs to be fixed there. But if you have a higher amount of education, you tend to then be in a more cognitively demanding job, because right, that's just the nature of the system on average. And then when those individuals retire, they have a bigger drop in terms of how cognitively demanding their life is, and actually they may be at bigger risk, right, because they've suddenly, right, their brain is used to these very complex inputs that they've been completely removed. So there's benefit to more cognitive demand early in life, but if you then remove that, you may have a bigger drop in terms of what happens. So it's this like complex interplay of what your brain is used to and what your brain wants to do, what you want your brain to do, and what you expose it to. But having said all that, when you look at several population studies that there's some in Sweden, France, China, the US, essentially, particularly if you retire early, you're at a greater risk of dementia, because and that's after you adjust for like medical conditions that might cause you to retire early and things like that, important confounders like that. And it's thought to be because you're removing the cognitive stimulus that you do get from your job. Now, of course, there are also studies as individuals get into their 70s and 80s that you can improve cognitive function as long as you then challenge the brain with new skills. They've taught individuals in their 70s or 80s like new languages, how to use technology, how to dance, these complex skills, and you see improvements in cognitive function. So it's not that retirement is this thing that is going to cause everybody to get dementia. It just means that we need to make sure that we continue to stimulate our brains after that happens. And I think people kind of appreciate that this is necessary, because you'll hear people say, well, I've retired, so I should take up Sudoku and crosswords to like keep my brain active. And those things aren't bad, but I would argue they're probably not the complex skill learning and social interactions and all these things that the brain really thrives on. So we probably need to put in a little bit more effort than that if we really want to maintain cognitive function over time.
Right. So I guess when you were starting it, if you're on a sort of slightly monotonous job that at the start might have been quite complex to learn, and then you've been doing it 20, 30 years, and you can do it, rinse, wash, and repeat, very easy for you. As opposed to those sort of slightly higher cognitive demanding jobs that might have a bit more novelty. Is novelty the key variable here of what is actually cognitively demanding?
Partly, yes. Particularly because the curve of, say, cognitive function or adaptation to a new thing is steepest right at the beginning. So you tend to learn the most and gain the most from things that you're bad at, like right at the beginning. So yes, novelty plays a role there, but equally, you do need some concerted effort. Just continuously being exposed to novel stimuli that you don't then engage with for some period of time before the next thing pops up. That's probably not going to be as good as concerted effort in learning one specific new thing, because you do need to spend some focused time gaining those skills. So yes, novelty is important, which is good because we're kind of drawn to things that are novel, but equally it probably needs some real work to gain those benefits.
Okay, so I want to ask about hobbies, and I guess of the spectrum of things you could replace work with. You mentioned Sudoku. You mentioned there's probably a spectrum of things that are wonderful and going to be really, really challenging and hard, and things that are less hard. But before I get into that, I want to ask about how important it is to you to do this. Essentially, having a why as to why to take up this, I guess, hobby or task, because my understanding is it's really viscerally important to you to learn this thing, it's more likely to signal change in your brain. And if it's just something you've just got to do because you're doing it for the sake of it, it's less cognitively, I guess, it's less likely to cause change. Have I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this does go back to that difference between the adult brain and the developing brain, right? Is you need to, in some way, signal to your brain that it is important that this skill be developed. And one of my favorite examples of this is a study that was actually done in barn owls. But there are almost exact like parallel studies in humans. So this isn't just like some weird thing about owls that isn't relevant to humans. But the owl example is a little bit more, you can sort of like really understand the importance of it. So Eric Knudsen was a neuroscientist at Stanford who 20 years ago or so, 25 years ago, did a lot of studies in barn owls. And one of the ways that he did these studies, and actually, again, very similar studies have been done in humans for more than 100 years, is he gave these owls prism glasses. And what that is there's these glasses that, and you can see these like pictures of owls with like these like cool goggles on. And what the prisms do is they shift where the light comes from. So where you think the thing is, that's not where it is, right? Because it's been shifted in your visual field. And they've done studies in humans where like their vision has been flipped completely upside down, or you might shift it by 90 degrees or whatever. You can do all these kinds of things. And when they put the prism glasses on these owls, if it was a young owl, they adapted automatically, right? The brain just shifted as it's in that kind of like sponge mode. It will just shift as needed. But in the adults, that didn't happen automatically, right? If you just you did nothing but like the owl was just sitting there and everything else was taken care of, and you put prism glasses on it, right? It was just like, well, this is weird, but I'm okay. And it didn't change. And again, that sort of that kind of information, if you just stop there, you'd be like, well, the adult brain is incapable of change, right? That's what they saw in the owls. But the next step of that study was that in order for the owls to eat, they had to hunt, right? So it's not like the food is just given to them. And if you just gave them the food, their brains wouldn't adapt because they don't need to, right? There's no necessity. But if the adult owls were forced to hunt in order to eat, they did change. So it required necessity and focus, right? Because it's really important. You want to eat. Your brain has got to adapt to make this happen. And they could even measure like how, as their hunting improved, they could map the visual field in the brain and see that it was shifting. So what this says is that if it's important and you interact with the environment and you drive this change because it's critical, there's like critical necessity. The adult brain is absolutely capable of adapting, but you need to make it important. And so then, if you think about skill development or other things you might do now for yourself, first you need to believe that it's possible. We talked about that. Then I think you need to do something that you're going to keep doing, right? So it needs to be something that either you enjoy or is important to you, because then that's going to create the situation where you will invest time and effort into that process and learn from it. So each of us wants to do different things with our brain. We want different skills. We're all incredibly individual in that area. So I couldn't say this is the one best thing that you should do, right, in order to drive cognitive function, because what I want my brain to do isn't the same as what you want your brain to do. So thinking about something that either you enjoy or that you have a real need to do and learn, that's going to create the environment that allows you to invest the time and other resources in doing that.
I'm so pleased. I've never heard of that study. It was it bridged a bit of a misunderstanding in me trying to piece this whole thing together. For me, when I can try and reconnect like a why I'm trying to learn this thing, I learn it so much better. And I never understood why until there. On that, is that the whole reason why there's this, I guess it's like anecdotes, not really scientific, but why people learn a lot better when they can, I guess, pair it with things that stimulate them. So for example, like coffee or an ice bath, people are saying there's this opera singer on Instagram who he started to learn his songs whilst he's in an ice bath. And he says, I learn it so much better because he thinks it stimulates. Is any the environment anything to that, or?
Yeah, probably. Caffeine is a slightly different beast for various reasons that we can get into. Often, two things happen if you're a habitual caffeine drinker. Two things are happening. One is that any improvement you feel in your mood and cognitive function is function restoration rather than function enhancement. Basically, before you drink caffeine, you're in a state of withdrawal, which decreases your cognitive function, and then it becomes restored by drinking caffeine rather than enhanced by drinking caffeine, if that makes sense. And then there's
Yes.
also a lot of evidence, caffeine and other stimulants. So they've done this with, like amphetamines, methylphenidate, those kinds of stimulants that people abuse to improve their cognitive function, but it's important for, say, individuals with ADHD. But when you take those stimulants, often you feel good, right? And you might improve things like very simple functions like reaction time. But when you do complex functions, caffeine can actually decrease your performance. So you feel like you're performing better, but actually you're performing worse. So it's just it's an interesting. I'm not. I'm not trying to be down on caffeine. I very much enjoyed my cup of coffee that I had before we had this conversation. So it's certainly can be beneficial in separate ways. But we think it's this magical thing that helps us do what we need to do, when in reality it's probably not. But now to your actual question. So yes, I could imagine a scenario where something like an ice bath could enhance learning, because the process of learning is enhanced by the release of various neurotransmitters that sort of come with being stressed or anxious. So things like adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine, these catecholamines is like that's the group of these neurotransmitters. They tend to help drive this learning process, and you don't need to do that with an ice bath, because it happens naturally in the setting of making mistakes. So when you make an error, there's this tension or frustration that's created, and actually that helps drive learning. So errors and mistakes are actually really critical to the learning process, and part of it is because the brain is constantly scanning for the difference between the expected outcome and the actual outcome, right? So if you're learning a song, the expected outcome is it's perfect, like pitch perfect. You remember all the words, right? The rhythm is as you want it, and then anything that isn't that is a mistake, and your brain is scanning for that, and then it's like, oh yeah, there's a mistake. And when that happens, you release some of these neurotransmitters. However, we also release those when we are exposed to things like cold or exercise, which is why maybe so in particular exercise and physical fitness seem to be very highly associated with the capacity for neuroplasticity, and exercise seems to augment some of the learning process. And that's probably, again, why it's helping to stimulate the production of some of these neurotransmitters, as well as other factors that support that process, like neurotrophic factors that are released when you exercise that may support learning.
Right. Okay. That's so interesting. It's almost like, if I hear you correctly, it helps to create that internal environment for change.
Exactly.
Going back to the caffeine thing, I recently, last Wednesday, just stopped drinking coffee because I'd wake up every morning, have a massive French press, and it would just do nothing. I was like, I need to have a week off. I need to do something different. This is just got way too used to this. And then actually had the first cup of coffee again today. Didn't quite make it to Wednesday, and definitely it's almost like it's back. It's the old feeling, I've missed you. It's good. I just want to go back to the hobbies thing in regards to new hobbies and hobbies that could be really beneficial. Would something like, I know I've heard you mention physical movement plus mental stimulation is quite good. It seems to be this multifactorial thing. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So, like I briefly mentioned, certainly physical activity seems to support the learning process. But if we're thinking about skills or activities that may be particularly beneficial for the brain, when they've looked at that in the physical realm, like the physical activity realm, then while there certainly are benefits, and I would encourage everybody to do both aerobic training or some kind of endurance training and strength training, resistance training. Those things are critically important for the brain. If you had to pick like one type of exercise that seems to be particularly beneficial for the brain, it's what they often call coordinative exercise, or in some studies they call it open skill exercise. So it's easier to maybe envision the opposite, which is closed skill or unimodal exercise, like sitting on a bike, going for a run. You're just like doing one thing, not engaging with the world, and continuing to do that for long periods of time. So that's very good from a cardiovascular standpoint, but less of a stimulus for the brain, as you might imagine. But then you might consider things like yoga, which have a very complex balance component, or team sports or ball sports, where you're constantly having to react to the environment. So they've done this with like badminton, table tennis. Certainly the same is going to be it's going to be the same for rugby or football. As long as you don't head the ball or have too many concussions, or that's its own thing. But these sports where you're constantly reacting to the environment, and maybe it's happening in a social environment, that's probably an additional benefit. So across both cognitive function and mental health, it seems that the quote unquote best exercise is dancing. And I don't mean that they've like compared dancing to table tennis in a large randomized controlled trial, but if you look at the effect size, so like what's the effect on cognitive function? In general, dancing always seems to be pretty good. And that's because it has like a physical activity component, right? A cardiovascular component, but there's also a coordination component, where you're constantly trying to learn how to move your body in 3D space. And there's a social component, right? Because usually you're dancing with somebody else. Not always, but if you're in a dance class, where they often do this, then you're dancing with other people. And there's a music component, and music seems to be its own beneficial stimulus for the brain. So like when you do something like dancing, you're ticking multiple boxes. But equally, you would probably get tick those same boxes if you took part in a team sport, or you did a yoga class or something like that, right? You're getting multiple complex inputs to the brain at the same time, and that seems to be particularly good in terms of supporting cognitive function.
So I guess when you compare something like dancing with all those 4 factors versus something like Sudoku, I guess you suddenly see the comparison of like how vastly different, I guess, the cognitive load, if I'm trying to use the correct vernacular, would be very different. How do we measure cognitive load then?
So this is part of the problem, which is that, so myself and Josh, who I mentioned earlier, we wrote a paper on the demand model a couple of years ago, and we had to acknowledge up front that while if you look at the wide range of literature that exists from animal models through to human studies, this kind of demand-driven process, that the most important thing for cognitive function being how we stimulate cognitive function, and then yes, other things become important like nutrition and sleep and all these other things. Just like if you want to maximize your athletic performance, the most important thing is your training, but you also need to rest and recover and eat properly and all those things. So you need to support that process if you want to maximize the outcome. So while we strongly believe that this is the case, that for the brain and cognitive function, it's really hard to test as a theory because it's very difficult to measure cognitive load or cognitive demand, especially in this like skill specific or region specific manner. So it's nice to have a theory, but it's hard if you then can't test it, and that in general is still something that's an issue. Now, often when people think about cognitive demand or cognitive load, they'll think about it in terms of a negative way, and so that can kind of be measured when if you're measuring, and a lot of this work is done by people like Gloria Mark, who look at multitasking, task switching, multimedia use. These things create significant cognitive load, and that's actually in many ways quite stressful and detrimental, because you're never able to really focus on one specific thing. So that's often how we think about cognitive load, and that is kind of measurable in various ways, because you can see when people they're trying to do a piece of work, and then there's an alert from their phone or from their email, and then they have to task switch. This creates like a slight stress response, and it decreases productivity as well as overall well-being. So that kind of cognitive load is in some ways measurable, but what the cognitive demand that I think is really important for long-term cognitive function is this more focused efforts in learning, and that's quite difficult to quantify. But you could say measure time spent learning a specific skill. And usually when you're trying to learn something new, you can't really do it for very long, right? Somewhere between 30 minutes and 90 minutes, maybe with some sort of small micro breaks in between. And so actually the standard kind of setup of a language class or an exercise class or something, that's generally how they set it up, right? There's some like warm up is like, it's about an hour. There's a warm up period. You spend some time kind of learning some new skill, maybe pushing the boundaries of what you're currently capable of. Then maybe you have a little bit of a break, and then you say, deploy that skill if you're learning a language, right, in a conversation with somebody else. And that whole thing takes an hour, and it is sort of cognitively fatiguing. That's probably kind of the structure you would use to think about these to think about these things. But I have to acknowledge that it is quite hard to quantify it. So you if you were trying to do this for yourself, it would be 2 or 3 times a week. You spend 30 to 90 minutes working at something at the edge of your current skills, right? You should be making mistakes. That suggests that you're sort of pushing the boundaries. That also, like we said, creates this environment to accelerate learning. And then you take breaks as needed, and then you come back to it in 2 or 3 days. That's kind of the structure that seems to work. But if I wanted to like really measure and quantify this process, that is quite difficult. We could probably do it if I had you in a big EEG setup and I'm measuring all the electrical activity in your brain and that kind of stuff. But that's just not really applicable.
You wouldn't see much going on, so wouldn't do it.
So it's technically possible, but not really done, which does make admittedly makes my my theory trickier to test.
Right. I guess. I mean, I mean, I know you spoke to earlier that feeling of agitation, that feeling of almost like a rep of lost focus, and bringing it back could be like a rep in the right direction. Or I don't know. When you said that feeling of agitation, I related to that in my own sort of way. With regards to learning these things, and I know it's so individually variable. Do they spill over into other aspects of cognitive function? And I guess this idea of like mental fitness. So, for example, if I learn to juggle and it has no relevance to my ability to public speak or be articulate or connect things, does that somehow translate over?
Depending on the skill, yes. And it certainly seems that, so say if you teach somebody how to dance, you might get improvements in decision making and executive function or reaction time. You've sort of improved overall cognitive fitness, for want of a better word. And there are lots of studies that have used, say, online brain training. There's a platform called Brain HQ, which was developed by Michael Merzenich, who was like one of the original neuroscientists who learned about learning. And that, even though it's this abstract online cognitive training platform, they've shown that it does have carryover into more sort of real world skills. So it seems if you're driving broad improvements in cognitive function with a skill, right? So if you're learning, again, so if you're learning a language and that stimulates several parts of the brain, you're usually doing it in a social setting, right? Or you're using it to apply in a social setting, which has its own benefits. You're really learning a wide range of skills and stimulating large parts of the brain in order to do that. And when you do that, you do seem to see carryover. Some of it, and the reason, another reason to kind of support the hypothesis of demand-driven function is that you can get very, very good at one thing, and doing so makes you less good at other things because you've invested so many resources into learning that one skill. So it's kind of like if you wanted to be an Olympic level marathon runner, you are not going to be a particularly good powerlifter, right? Because you've just completely changed your physiology to be so specifically good at marathon running. And a nice example of this in terms of the brain is one of my favorite studies. It was published in Current Biology now nearly 15 years ago. And they looked at the brains and the cognitive function of individuals who are learning the knowledge to drive black cabs in London. So for those who don't know, I'm not sure it's that relevant anymore because of Uber and things like that. But back in the day, if you wanted to be a cabbie in London, you had to learn the knowledge, which is the map. You had to memorize the map of 25,000 streets in a 6-mile radius around Charing Cross Station in central London. And this takes 2 or 3 years. And these individuals were on average sort of in their mid-30s, right? So now we're past that point where you supposedly can't learn anything, but obviously they did. And they had 3 groups. They had those who studied for the test and passed, those who studied for the test and failed, and then a control group that they just followed for the same period of time. And what they found was that in those who studied the test and passed, compared to the other two groups, you could see changes in related areas of the brain on an MRI scan. They'd essentially like improved the structure of this part of the brain by challenging it, right? Just like challenging a muscle. And actually, there are other studies in juggling. We teach people how to juggle, and you can see changes in the brain, particularly in the visual cortex, because actually juggling is more of a visual skill than a motor skill. And then as they stop juggling, you can see those changes disappear again. Just like if you stop exercise, you learn that you lose that specific fitness. But in the knowledge study, what was interesting is that these people have become so good at memorizing a map that actually they became less good at memorizing other more abstract things, whereas the other group didn't change. So they kind of directed all their resources into this very specific function, and then as a result, the brain had to decrease functions elsewhere in order to have this improvement in a very specific function. So all that to say that if you learn broader skills that use lots of aspects of the brain, and that's, like we said, movement, language, music, these kinds of things, there does seem to be carryover to other cognitive functions. But you can become so good at one thing that actually the brain draws resources away from other skills. So it's kind of the difference between being a general athlete, somebody who does a little bit of everything just to stay physically fit, and for that you might learn music or dance or a language, versus somebody who needs to be the best in the world at one very specific thing, and then they acknowledge that they're going to be less good at other things because they've directed so many resources into that. And that's important if you're a professional athlete, right? Or if you're a surgeon, you're probably invested so much effort into being, having those physical skills that maybe you become slightly less good at other things, but that's fine because that's important. That's your brain adapting to the environment that it's in. So all of that body of evidence, I think, helps support this idea that cognitive function is really demand driven, and then it comes down to, well, what do you want your brain to do, and then you can work from there.
Love that. It's so interesting with all the different examples you're pulling on. I'd love to shift over to ApoE4, and maybe just for the listener who hasn't heard of ApoE4, like a really quick sort of what is ApoE4. I know recently it's been it's in the common vernacular, and it's quite scary for a lot of people from a few books that have been released and a few documentaries. But what is ApoE4, and how does it relate to cognitive decline?
So ApoE or apolipoprotein E is one of several apolipoproteins, which are essentially proteins whose job it is to carry fats around the body. So if you think about, if you do a cholesterol test, most of the cholesterol you measure, so like people might be familiar with LDL cholesterol, most of that is ApoB containing lipoproteins, whereas HDL cholesterol is ApoA. They're all part of these sort of like super family of proteins that shuttle fats around the body. ApoE comes in 3 flavors, 2, 3, and 4. So you can have any combination of those. We have 2 copies each. And ApoE4, having 1 copy, seems to increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease and dementia something like 2 to 6 times. And having 2 copies, if you're homozygous, as they call it for ApoE4, it might be double that again. Maybe you get to sort of 5 or 6 to 12 or 20 times increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. And there was a recent paper actually that came out just a couple of weeks ago that suggested that if you had ApoE4, that was like its own kind of genetic type of Alzheimer's disease that was separate from all other Alzheimer's disease. Although I would argue that that's not true for a number of reasons that I'll get into. But we know that in industrialized, westernized, largely Northern European ancestry populations, having 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4 increases your risk of Alzheimer's disease. There are several populations where, and just to kind of give a little bit more background, it's thought that again, just to be slightly reassuring, it's thought that your ApoE genotype, so not just having ApoE4, like your total genotype, contributes something like 5% of your total risk of Alzheimer's disease. So actually quite a small component. Of course, having ApoE4 does increase your risk, but as they often say, most people who have Alzheimer's disease don't have ApoE4, and not everybody who has ApoE4 gets Alzheimer's disease, right? So it's not this death sentence. When you look at populations who don't live, right, I told you about the lifestyle that is going to maximally give you cognitive decline and dementia. For those people who don't live that kind of lifestyle, or they live, maybe they have other ancestral backgrounds, or they live in other areas around the world, you don't see that relationship between ApoE4 and dementia. So they've studied that in the Bolivian Chimene, who are a hunter-gatherer group in Bolivia. They've studied it in the Nigerian Yoruba. So now we're talking on the African continent, so like the other side of the world from the Bolivian Chimene, and they've also studied it in indigenous American populations in the US. And in those groups, ApoE4 is not associated with Alzheimer's disease. And actually, in the Bolivian Chimene, in certain settings, it was actually protective of cognitive decline. Then there are some other studies that show that people of the same ancestry living in different environments, ApoE4 has a different effect. So there was a study that looked at people of a southern Italian ancestry who were in southern Italy. ApoE4 has less of an association with dementia risk than people of the same ancestry living in America. So again, what I think all of that says is that ApoE4 is this, if it does increase risk, it's a gene times environment interaction. So if you put somebody with ApoE4 in the environment that maximally supports dementia or generates dementia, I think you will get a bigger effect. But then I also believe, because of all those other studies, that if you don't live that lifestyle, or if you don't live in that environment, your risk is not elevated. So all that to say that even somebody living in the UK or the US, if you take steps to tick all these boxes that protect long-term cognitive function, I don't believe ApoE4 is going to be a big contributor to your overall risk because of this interaction with the environment.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's it's a lovely optimistic message. I think people have, as you said, they've viewed it as a bit of a death sentence. So I was with my mum on the weekend, and she is, I was saying I was prepping for this podcast and getting all about it. And I said, "You got any questions?" And one of her questions was, so I'm 28. If I was to optimize my cognitive function and I was to try to ward off cognitive decline, would the same protocols be relevant for someone who is, I guess, I don't know, out my mum's age online, but towards middle-aged, sort of getting towards 65-ish, around there? How would those two people approach that differently or in the same vein?
It's essentially exactly the same. So we've kind of touched on some of these ideas of things that would support cognitive function, but essentially the things that I would tell you are the same things I would tell your mum. And there was a nice kind of example of this that was published a few years ago. It's called the finger trial. There's a study done in Finland where they looked at people at high risk of cognitive decline because of their cardiovascular and physical health, and they had a control group who just sort of got like the standard of care. But in the intervention group, they did lots of the things that we've talked about. So they gave them a cognitive training program. They gave them a physical activity program that included aerobic training and strength training. They improved their diet, and they monitored their cardiovascular risk, because vascular function is really important for brain function, because you need the blood vessels to respond and deliver oxygen and nutrients to the parts of the brain that are active. And when they did that, they saw, and this is individuals in their 70s, they saw significant improvements in cognitive function. And in the control group, they did also see significant improvements because as you get exposed to a test, you get better at doing the test, right? So even in their 70s, these people at high risk, they are getting better at something because they're being exposed to it, right? So the brain is adapting even at that age in those who are high risk. But they saw greater improvements in those who sort of ticked all those boxes. But I would tell you that's exactly the same thing that I told you, right? Nutrition is important, physical activity is important, cognitive demand and cognitive stimulus is important. So essentially, right, you might have to think about, lots of this is individualized. Like, what is your rate limiting step for cognitive function may not be the same as your mum's, right? Maybe yours is sleep and hers is learning a new skill. Or yours is nutrient status and hers is cardiovascular risk or something like that, right? These rate limiting steps may be different from person to person, but if I was going to provide like this model of what you need to do, it's identical essentially regardless of your age.
And is it identical across the sexes as well?
Yes. In terms of all of those other components we've talked about, it is.
Correct.
The risk of dementia, though, is not similar across sexes. Right? Women are about twice as likely to get Alzheimer's disease, in particular, which is sort of the most common cause of dementia. And there are a few reasons for this. Probably the most understudied but critically important one is hormonal status. So estrogen levels and other hormones, but estrogen levels in particular around the menopausal transition, so before and after menopause, it seems to be really critical for cognitive function. And we know that estrogen is in its own way a neurotrophic factor. It supports cognitive function. So there isn't really good randomized control evidence, but it certainly seems that if you have sensible hormone replacement therapy started early, there seems to be a reduction in the risk of dementia. So there is this hormonal component. There's certainly part of the reason why women are at greater risk of dementia. The other things include, men die of something else first, right? They die of heart disease first before they have a chance to get Alzheimer's disease. So there's this complex interplay of these different things. But it's not the prevalence or incidence of Alzheimer's disease is not the same across the sexes. But in terms of the model of what we can do to improve this, 95+% of it is the same. It's also interesting because I mentioned cardiovascular risk, and there's some evidence to suggest that because of, in the last few decades, medicine has really focused on heart disease. There has been a slight reduction in the likelihood of getting dementia because of the benefits of improving cardiovascular function, cardiovascular risk on the brain. But that effect appears to maybe be greater in men. It's not like statistically significant better in men, but that it seems that if you kind of look at it, and in some studies there is a greater benefit in men, but overall seems as maybe a slightly greater benefit in men because cardiovascular risk is greater in men overall. So by focusing on cardiovascular risk, we have decreased the likelihood that at any given age you will have dementia. But that benefit is maybe slightly greater in men because that contributes a greater risk in men. So that's maybe increased the gap between men and women in dementia. It's like almost, which unfortunately is quite inequitable. So we need to have a greater focus on dementia in women in particular. And luckily there are some researchers who are working on that. People like Lisa Mosconi, who's written 2 excellent books and does a lot of research in that area. And just to kind of finish that point, because I've just told you that the likelihood that you'll get dementia is decreased, and everything that you will have heard says that your likelihood of dementia is increasing over time. And that technically, both those things are true and can be true at the same time. So at a given age, it is now less likely that you'll get dementia than it was 20 or 30 years ago. But we're living longer. So overall, your likelihood of getting dementia is actually higher across your entire lifetime. So this tells us a few things. One is that if we really focus on a specific area of health, we can decrease the risk of dementia. And there's lots of evidence now to suggest that probably the majority of dementia is preventable. So we can do that at the population level. But partly because we've gotten so good at treating other diseases, now dementia is likely to increase because you're going to live longer, and the longer you live, the greater your likelihood of getting dementia. Now, I realize that none of that is tied to your original question about sex, but I think I just kind of had to make that point because people might have been confused as to is dementia risk increasing, decreasing, and the answer is yes, just depending on how you look at the data and the trajectory.
No, it's great, and I love a tangent. It's always far more interesting than any question I ask, which is great. It makes me feel really good about my job. I love what you said about the cardiovascular, I guess, system. And one of my favorite episodes of your podcast, Better Brain Health. Am I right?
Better Brain Fitness.
Better Brain Fitness, that's it,
Yeah.
which I really liked, was the episode you did on Little Blue Pill,
Oh
and
yeah.
how Viagra has proposed mechanisms to help ward off cognitive decline. I'd love it if you could just shed a little bit of light on that, because I thought it was so interesting.
Sure. So there's actually so sildenafil, it's a phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitor, and what it mainly does is it enhances blood flow. So in those who have erectile dysfunction because of issues with blood flow, it helps to, generate and sustain erections. There's also a lot of research in various areas that I do sort of basic science, and one of those is in newborn brain injury. There's lots of evidence to suggest that sildenafil is also neuroprotective. Like, it directly protects the brain against injury. And there are randomized controlled trials where they're giving sildenafil to babies with brain injury to see if it will decrease their risk of long-term neurodevelopmental impairment or disability. So I was interviewed for like a news piece on a study that came out of the UK, where they looked at men who had erectile dysfunction and those who did or didn't get prescribed erectile dysfunction drugs, and the most common one is sildenafil or Viagra. There are some others who work in the same area, but that's the one that is most routinely used. And then they collected information up to the point where a few years ago you could get it. You started to be able to get it over the counter. So that was when the study stopped, because once you can get it over the counter, it's much harder to track. But what they found is that in men who received these phosphodiesterase 5 inhibitors, and primarily Viagra, they had a decreased risk of dementia. And then the question was, like, why might this be? And so there's a number of reasons why this might be. We talked about blood flow being really important, and it can sildenafil can improve blood flow to the brain. And that's one of the ways that exercise supports cognitive function. So that kind of fits in that sphere. It also seems to have some other effects in terms of protecting neurons, like we talked about in other brain injuries. And so that could be why it shows benefit. But then, you also have to talk about, well, maybe this is just what we call confounding, right? There's actually a whole separate reason that that's driving this, separate from, say, these mechanisms that we can kind of envision. So one might be, well, maybe men who get Viagra versus those who don't are different, right? They're willing to go to a doctor and talk about this problem of erectile dysfunction, and maybe they have, maybe they also have a relationship where it's important to have sexual function, so because that's part of the relationship. And we already talked about the importance of social connection and these other things. So what didn't make it into the interview online, but that I think is a critically important part of this, is that maybe either these men have relationships that are supportive, and that's decreasing their risk of dementia, and then whether they go and get Viagra is kind of just comes along for the ride because they want that to be part of their relationship. Or maybe the fact that you're restoring sexual function then restores somebody's willingness and abilities to go out and have relationships and improve their social connection. So maybe it's all driven by social connection and actually has nothing to do with actual Viagra. The answer is we don't know, but I think it's interesting to think about all these different aspects, this complex part of sexual function and these drugs that we take. And so, I think it's worth taking away that if you're going to go out and get Viagra, which if you need it, you should, probably most of the benefit comes from what happens after you take it, or the reason why you take it, rather than just like this pill going to be magic for your brain on its own, if that makes sense.
I think it does. Yeah. I like what you said about, it could be multiple factors all at once, or it could be, things we don't even know about, or the social connection piece, which inevitably is so hard to even quantify, but doesn't mean it's not important, right? I would love to get into, I guess, supplements and nutrients, but again, in a way of trying to make the question quite slightly more interesting for you, because I know you've been asked that all the time, and anyone can go on YouTube and find Tommy's answer for that. If you were to go long, some undervalued nutritional supplement, or it could be nutritional supplement, something that's underutilized or undervalued, and if you had to go short, something that's overvalued, overhyped, specifically when it comes to brain health, what would you go long and what would you go short?
So I think going long, what's underutilized and probably there's a step before utilizing the supplement. It's understanding your own personal risk. That's certainly underutilized, which is testing for two things in particular. And there are lots of things that are important, but two things that I think are underutilized and under tested for when actually access to these tests is very easy and it's not particularly expensive, is omega-3 status and homocysteine as a measure of B vitamin status. And several studies show that these two things interact. So if you have high homocysteine, which is generally due to being insufficient in one or more of folate, B12, B6, and B2, which is riboflavin. If you decrease homocysteine in those who have elevated homocysteine by supplementing with B vitamins, but they don't have good omega-3 status, you don't see any benefit. And the opposite is also true. If you supplement individuals, and this is in randomized controlled trials, if you supplement individuals with omega-3s, but they have high homocysteine because they don't have good enough B vitamin status, you don't see any benefit. But if you have both, then you see significant improvements in cognitive function and slowing of cognitive decline. So another aspect of what, if I was going to go long on something, is so what is underutilized is thinking about how risk factors interact. Like, we often think that if I do this one thing, I'm going to see benefit, and in reality, that's not the case, unfortunately. Right? The brain is a complex thing, and it requires multiple things in order to be healthy. And so you might have seen several studies that say, well, omega-3s don't work because we supplemented with omega-3s and we didn't see a reduction in dementia risk. And that's because they didn't address homocysteine and vice versa. So it's not a single variable problem. But that's probably two of the most important things that are underutilized is measuring status and nutrient requirement for those, because it's going to be very different from person to person, and then supplementing if needed. In terms of things that are overhyped and overutilized, I think probably I'm just going to throw all nootropics under the bus, because we're kind of sold all these different compounds and things that are supposed to support cognitive function. And so for those who don't know, a nootropic is supposed to be something that improves cognitive function, doesn't generate dependence or tolerance so that you need to increase the dose to still see benefit, and doesn't have any negative effects. In reality, what often happens with a lot of these drugs or compounds, often they're sort of naturally derived compounds of various things, and you can buy these fancy supplements. Often what happens is, yes, you might get an augmentation of one type of cognitive function, but you're probably doing it to the detriment of another, like we talked about earlier, right? If you sort of really drive one function, you're decreasing others. Maybe that's useful if you're for a very specific thing that you're trying to do. But in general, what happens is that we think that we're seeing benefit from these either because of placebo or because they make us feel better, like we talked about with caffeine. But they're actually not having a significant benefit, and this happens across the board. So there are studies that in cannabis that show this, right? Where people think that when they take cannabis, they're more creative, and they feel more creative, and it improves their mood. But then when you objectively measure creativity, actually it doesn't change, or it gets worse. So often there's this, when we're taking these things and we think we're seeing benefit, if we were going to objectively measure them, we're probably not. So addressing nutrient status, addressing physical health, that's real bang for your buck, and not very exciting, but certainly has a lot of scope for benefit. Taking any expensive fancy supplements that are supposed to augment or increase cognitive function, there is some benefit, and we could certainly talk about each compound one by one and find some things that are maybe worth taking. But in general, I think the hype is oversold when we know there's other things like, I would much rather you go for a brisk walk to improve your cognitive function than, spend X amount of money on some fancy supplement that will supposedly do that.
I love that answer. I think everyone wants a pill, but I mean the 2011 film Limitless, right? That set this whole thing off of, if there was a pill to, maximize your brain in all sorts of way, what would it be? And actually, it's often, I've heard it's often the unsexy stuff, like you said, a brisk walk or some hill sprints. What is the in the film, the pill is called NZT.
Mhm.
What would be the equivalent? That's not a pill or a supplement. The equivalent of actually trying to, if you had a pitch or something to go, how would you get your brain in gear for that?
So, in terms of like the equivalent that could give you maximum cognitive function.
Yes. Obviously, not to some sort of weird kind of superhuman thing, but you get the most out of your own brain, I guess.
Yeah. So this kind of I've done a lot of work in this recently, primarily in my work with Formula One drivers, trying to think about how do you create the environment for optimal cognitive function. And there's two large. So one is like really setting the ground, and that includes everything like training, nutrient status, all this kind of stuff that we know is important. But shorter term, there's probably two main things. One is sleep. Like sleep is probably the most important thing, after skill specific demand and all that kind of stuff that we talked about. But then once you're adequately rested, so if you're adequately rested, you create the potential for good cognitive function. And then if you want to optimize your cognitive function, it's in the moment, it's generally driven by your arousal state. And like psychology is important, being confident, thinking you're capable of doing it, and all those kinds of things too. So I don't want to like downplay that, but especially in the sporting arena. But arousal is really critical for optimal cognitive function. And there's this idea in sports called the Yerkes-Dodson arousal curve, where if you imagine on the side, on the y-axis, you have performance, or in this case, cognitive function for a specific cognitive function that you want to perform at, and on the x-axis along the bottom, you have arousal, and basically it's a bell curve. So if you have low arousal, you don't have much cognitive function, and that's when you're like bored, detached, disengaged, right? Or if you have low arousal because you're sleep deprived, right? Then you have low function. At the other end, if you're really stressed or anxious, or you've had too many espressos, right? You're over aroused, then function declines again, and that's been shown across the interventional literature in humans. But there's a sweet spot of arousal, and then through at the peak of the bell curve, you can get into states like, in sports they call them clutch states. So that's when you're performing really highly, but it's still like really cognitively demanding. You have to work really hard to get that job done. And then also it's possible to have a flow state, and flow states are where you effortlessly and maximally express some learned complex skill. And so that could be sport, but it could be music and other things. Those are both possible at that kind of peak of the curve. And then it becomes about, well, how do I move myself up and down the curve in order to sort of be near the top of that bell curve? And it's also important to remember that the bell curve is different for different functions that you want. So again, I'll take this to sport. So you imagine the Olympic final in sprinting and the Olympic final in archery. These are athletes at the top of the sport, the best in the world, but they want very different levels of arousal to perform at their best, right? The sprinter needs to be right down at the end, really very aroused, and they work very hard to like be just like on a knife edge, like ready to go as soon as the gun goes. Whereas an archer needs to be down at the other end. They need to be super chill and relaxed to be able to take their shots. So just remember that for a given skill or part of cognitive performance, you need a different level of arousal. And so ways that you might get yourself up and down are generally related to ways that you manipulate your physiology. So how you use exercise, meditation, breath work. So breath work can increase and decrease arousal. Light can increase, darkness can decrease arousal. Temperature increases arousal. Cold increases arousal generally. Warmth tends to decrease arousal. So it becomes about how do you create a routine that optimizes your physiology for the state in which you want to function. And then you can know that, if you get really anxious, maybe some period of meditation or relaxing breath work, long exhales, slow paced breathing, that can sort of like bring you back. Whereas if you need to get amped up, loud music, like bright lights, there's studies on people like shouting at you to kind of like get you going, or you can like brief periods of hyperventilation. So another type of breath work can kind of increase your arousal. So And then it just becomes about understanding your physiology so that you can get yourself in the right state of mind to perform at the thing that you want to perform at.
What an awesome framework. I love that. And I love that the tools weren't some pill or things. There were things like light and breath work and
Yeah.
various different playing with temperature. What a really cool answer. Last question before we leave you. I'd love to, your talk you did at the CrossFit, I think it's called the CrossFit Summit. Apologies, I'm messing it up. But the CrossFit event you spoke at, I thought was a wonderful talk, and listeners should definitely check it out on YouTube. When it comes to lifting weights and cognitive function, can we squeeze some sort of benefit? Is there something to do with lifting weights and how it affects our cognitive performance and health?
Yeah. So there are some. Actually, we've just had a paper accepted. There's a really big review paper on resistance training or strength training, and particularly the way that it affects the brain and the parts of the brain that are at risk in dementia and cognitive decline. So where you seem to see most of the benefit is in the white matter that I mentioned earlier that's responsible for these fast connections, which does seem to degenerate in certain areas of the brain as we sort of enter dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And there are multiple studies in older individuals, so individuals in their 60s and 70s, and then also there's been studies specifically in postmenopausal women looking at resistance training interventions and then cognitive function and brain structure. And I'll give you the short answer, which is that resistance training at least twice a week for at least 6 months seems to significantly improve cognitive function and protect those areas of the brain that seem to be at greatest risk in the process of Alzheimer's disease. And it's like the absolute basics, right? Twice a week, maybe 3 times a week. You do 45 minutes to an hour. You do 6 to 8 different exercises that cover the entire body, and you do 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps. Like the most basic resistance training program that anybody can do. You can use machines. It doesn't need to be free weights or anything complicated. You could probably get it done in an hour max, if not less. That is like the minimum effective dose in terms of resistance training being shown to improve both brain structure and function. And this is, even late in life.
Love that. I'm trying to get my mum to lift weights, and so that clip just there nailed it. A yo-yo like me, she doesn't listen, but now she's got to take note. Tommy, thank you so much for that. I could sit and chat all day and pepper you with all sorts of questions. It was really, really fascinating. Where can we find you and keep up to date with what you're up to?
The probably the easiest place is Instagram. So I'm at Dr. Tommy Wood on Instagram. And then you mentioned the podcast, the Better Brain Fitness podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from. It's a question and answer style. So we have an online platform where people can submit questions, and then we answer one question a week. Josh and I take turns depending on the topic. So he's a neurologist, I'm a neuroscientist, so it kind of depends on which falls more into one of our remits. And then we also have a Substack where if you go to betterbrain.fitness and you put in your email, so it's a free Substack, and we release, when we publish articles, when we publish podcasts, you get them for free through Substack. And particularly when you sign up, you get sent a PDF that has some blood tests and nutrients, like some of the things that we talked about. But also, what should you get tested? What should you aim for? What foods could you eat to improve some of these nutrients that are important for long-term brain health? That's like a free download that you get when you sign up.
Wonderful. Well, look, thanks so much again for coming on. Really enjoyed that. And thanks again.
Thank you. It was really great chatting with you. I really appreciate your time.